Got a great show for you today. So excited to introduce Dr. Fiona Francis, who is presenting the impacts of commercial anchoring in British Columbia. Her background is in marine ecology and recently did her postdoc on this type of work. So she was working in the South Salish Sea and then also up on the North Coast related to anchoring impacts on the benthic community. So has a lot of really interesting information today, primarily discussing the Salish Sea, but also further north because of our other ports up there. Sorry, I've got a million things popping up on my screen. So like Marielle mentioned, you could feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll let Fiona continue through her whole presentation, and then we'll have time at the end available for questions. Hands up at the end would be appreciated. It's always nice to have some face-to-face contact. Well, screen-to-screen contact anyway. And if you can just have your cameras off during the presentation, other than our presenter, it just saves on some bandwidth. Feel free to type in the chat your name and what organization you're from, and also any Indigenous land acknowledgement that you would like to add in the chat. Fiona and I are joining you from West Vancouver today, which is the home of Coast Salish peoples, including Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. So really excited to be able to share this interesting, very relevant and topical work today. And with that, I think we'll just let Fiona take it away.
Thanks, Cher, and thanks, Marielle, for having me. I just wanted to check, can people see that, like, people popping up on this screen, or is that
we just
like
keep admitting them in the background. Yeah.
Okay,
so
great.
You that.
I wasn't
away.
sure if that's annoying. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Cher, for that introduction. As Cher said, my name is Fiona Francis, and I am a research biologist working in the Ecosystem Stressors program as part of DFO Science. And I'm really excited today to be talking about some of the research that we've been doing on the impacts of commercial anchoring in British Columbia. And so just to give a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today, as Cher mentioned, I'm going to start by talking a bit about the background of commercial anchoring, what it is, why do we care about it, and then spend the majority of the talk talking about some of the research we've been doing in the Salish Sea over the past few years. And then wrapping up, highlighting some of the current work that we're doing on the north coast of British Columbia, focused around anchorages in the port of Prince Rupert. So let's dive on in. So about 80% of global trade is moved, at least in part, through maritime shipping. So marine trade is moved through a network of coastal ports, and these ports connect vessels to land and air transportation systems. With increases in marine trade, there's also been increasing congestion at a lot of these ports. And so many of the ports are turning to the use of commercial anchorages. So commercial anchorages are essentially large marine parking spots for these big ships to wait while they're waiting for access to berths or to port. So this is an image that I took. It's in English Bay, which is just outside the port of Vancouver, in the Salish Sea, so potentially an area that many of you are familiar with. And the Port of Vancouver is the largest port that we have in Canada. And so it has a lot of traffic moving in and out of it, but it's actually ranked as one of the worst ports in the world globally for waiting times to get into the port. And so as a result, in this area, the use of commercial anchorages is really on the rise. And you can see that pattern in this figure here. So on the y-axis, we see the total number of anchoring events. And on the x-axis, we have time in years from 2008 to 2021, which is this data set that we've been working with. And you can see that over time, there's been this steady increase in the number of anchoring events in British Columbia. You can also see that the size of the dot in this figure indicates the mean percent of the year that an average anchorage is occupied. And so with the increasing size of dots, you can also see that the amount of time that ships are spending in these anchorages is also increasing. This increase is also happening on a spatial scale. So in this moving figure, where every panel is a new year, you can see that the dots that are represented in pink, these are the anchorages located around and close to the Port of Vancouver. But over time, the dots that are yellow, these are commercial anchorages in the Southern Gulf Islands, are really expanding. So the use of these anchorages has really been increasing over time. And this spatial expansion into some of these southern Gulf Islands has raised a lot of concern from local groups and local First Nations about the potential impact of having these really large vessels anchoring in these coastal areas and what this can be doing to both coastal communities and to the seafloor. And so there are a number of different potential stressors that can come from having these commercial anchorages. Um, Things like really bright lights that these vessels have on at night, and the presence of these really big ships can impact coastal communities. The dropping of large anchors and huge amounts of chain from these ships can also disrupt the bottom of the seafloor. And also, with the movement of these vessels, you can also have things like the introduction of invasive species, such as this fouling tunicate up on the right-hand corner of the screen, and damage to sensitive benthic ecosystems. So this is a forest of sea whips, which are a type of sea pen that are quite delicate. And you can imagine if you're dropping a heavy anchor in this area that you're potentially damaging a lot of these animals. And so while there are all these potential stressors, there's also different parts of the ecosystem that they can impact. So having these vessels in these areas can have social and cultural impacts for coastal communities. It can also impact marine habitats as well as marine organisms. And so while there are these potential stressors that can impact different areas, there hasn't been a lot of work to date done on commercial anchoring. So there was a big review done in 2020 by some of my colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, basically highlighting that commercial anchoring is this big gap in our understanding of commercial shipping as a whole. And while in the past few years, there has been an increase in work done on commercial anchoring, it's mostly been limited to areas where, unlike in Pacific Canada, they simply have anchoring zones where ships can drop anchor wherever they want within a region. Or these studies are using ship movement as a proxy for impacts on the seafloor, or focusing on a single anchorage. So they don't have the system of commercial anchorages that we see here on the Pacific coast. So because of this knowledge gap, our group decided to work on a 3-year project where we wanted to look at some of the potential impacts from these anchorages in British Columbia. And we used a suite of 116 active commercial anchorages in BC. So these are primarily clustered down here on the right-hand side of the screen around the port of Vancouver and the Southern Gulf Islands. But there's also a cluster of anchorages, which I'll talk about a bit later, around the port of Prince Rupert. And the nice thing about this network of anchorages is that we have really good documented usage by ships for these anchorages, because many of them, because they're located in coastal waters, require a pilot vessel to come and help guide them into these areas. And the Pacific Pilotage Authority keeps very good records of when pilots embark and disembark from ships. And so this project is something that we've undertaken in our group, but we're also collaborating very closely with some colleagues at Natural Resources Canada, as well as Transport Canada and the Canadian Hydrographic Service to do this project. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time overviewing the different aspects of this work and some of the results that we found. And just to further situate you, I just wanted to put in a little bit of a close-in map of those anchorages again in the Southern Gulf Islands, as well as around the Port of Vancouver. And just highlight one key aspect of these designated anchorages is that around each anchorage location, which is a set GPS coordinate that ships are given, they also are required to remain within a set area around each of these points, which is designated by a certain swing radius for the circle they must stay in. And so we used this sort of measure in this area a lot in our work to try and understand how ships are using these anchorages. So we focused on 3 main areas of research as part of this project, and I will go through each of these in a little bit of detail. And the first one was really trying to understand what are the stressors and potential effects of commercial anchoring. And so in this image, which we had a really awesome graphic designer make for us, I've just highlighted in yellow some of the potential stressors that can come from commercial ships. So we have things like acoustic disturbance. These ships can be very noisy when they're located in an area. and also things like contaminant release, so things that are coming from potential leaks or spills from these vessels. And so some of these stressors we can see could have impacts in different aspects of the ecosystem. So for example, there might be impacts on cultural and community in some of these coastal areas, impacts on human health, on marine habitats, marine organisms, and also potentially economic impacts for some of these areas that they're located in. And so while I won't go into detail, what we did is we did a really large literature search, trying to outline all of the potential connections between some of these stressors and the different aspects of the ecosystem that they can impact. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. And so I'm happy to talk about this further in the questions. I also have just labeled at the bottom that we published a paper on this work in 2024, where we developed a tool to help coastal communities and different groups identify which of these linkages are potentially the most important in the different areas that they are situated in. So after doing more of this desktop review, I really wanted to get into some of the work we've been doing looking at the physical impacts of commercial anchorages. So this map is simply to highlight, again, this is the Port of Vancouver and the Southern Gulf Island anchorages. And all of the anchorages highlighted in green are study sites that we were looking at. And we also used a number of reference sites, which are located in similar basins with similar sediment characteristics adjacent to some of these commercial anchorages to make some comparisons. So for a lot of this impact work, we made use of multi-beam data. So multi-beam data is high resolution mapping of the seafloor that provides really detailed 3D imagery of the bottom of the ocean. And we're really fortunate that the Canadian Hydrographic Survey has done a large number of these surveys and mapped a large part of the British Columbia seafloor. I've included a link to their data portal in case you're interested in going in and looking at where some of this data has been collected. But in this image on the right, you can see that this high resolution bathymetry allows us to look at some of these anchorage areas in detail. So this is a cluster of 6 anchorages located in Trincomalee Channel, which is one cluster of anchorages in the Southern Gulf Islands. And if we zoom in on one of these anchorages, you can see that in this multi-beam data, we're able to look at specific features and disturbances on the bottom of the ocean using this data. And so there are a few different ways that we've been using this data to try and understand impacts around these anchorages. The first one is a very sort of visual initial look at disturbances around anchorages. So you can see in this image that some of these, long marks are potential scour marks from anchors being dragged in these areas. There's also smaller abrasion marks that can come from the anchor chain as a ship is moving around with tides and currents while at anchor. And so one of the first things that we did was to delineate some of these really distinctive marks simply by digitizing them in a mapping program. And so this was done by our colleague Karen Douglas, who works at NRCan, and she has published a data set of these scours. I've added the link to it here, where she's basically, I think, gone through 63 different multi-beam data sets across the coast, looking around these anchorages to delineate individual scour marks. So while these scours don't capture all of the disturbance at an anchorage, they do allow us to look at some patterning around these anchorages. So as I mentioned earlier, ships are required to stay within a swing circle or swing radius when they're at anchor. And so that's what's delineated by these dashed blue circles. And so when we look at these digitized lines, we can compare, how many of these lines are staying within these swing circles or how many of them are outside of them. And when we investigate a broader set of these anchorages, we really found that some of these scour marks can be very long. So we found ones that were over 2 kilometers long around some of these anchorages. And that in many cases, these scour marks, this scouring is extending well outside the swing radius. So the disturbance to the bottom of the ocean is not being limited to this area where ships are supposed to stay when they're at anchor. To try and capture a little bit more of the disturbance, we also looked at the ruggedness of the seafloor around these anchorages. So these anchorages are situated in generally flat, soft sediment areas that have good holding for anchors. And so we can look at how bumpy the bottom of the ocean is essentially around these points to try and understand how much disturbance has been caused by anchoring activity in the area. And so we use this measure of ruggedness where you can delineate in a set area around an anchorage how bumpy the bottom of the seafloor is. We can also pair this with looking at depth profiles to try and understand how deep into the substrate some of these scour marks and these troughs go. So we can draw a transect across some of these anchorages. And then if we translate this to a depth profile with distance along the transect, we can compare how deviations in depth are different than mean changes in bathymetry to try and understand how deep some of these individual marks are. So using both of these sets of data, we can then ask questions about how does use of anchorages, how does the number of ships and the activity that's happening at these anchorages impact measures of ruggedness and the depths of disturbance in these areas. And so just really quickly, I'll go over a couple of the results that we found. So this is a figure showing ruggedness on the y-axis. It's a unitless measure between 0 and 1. And on the x-axis, we have thumbed occupancy time pre-multi-beam survey. So that's basically just the number of hours that an anchorage has been occupied by a ship before the multi-beam data was collected. And so if we look at a number of anchorages, accounting for various different variables between basins, we see that there is this really sort of clear pattern where the more an anchorage is used, it really has become more rugged. So it's quite disturbed in a lot of these areas. If we then look at depth, so on the y-axis, we have sediment disturbance depth. And then on the x-axis, we have distance from center. So if we're interested in how the depth of disturbance is changing as you move away from the center of an anchorage where you might expect the highest disturbance to be. You can also then see that the depth of some of these troughs, these disturbances into the seafloor, are much bigger in the center of these anchorages and get smaller as you move away from the center. And so this is only a distance of about 200 meters from the center. So this pattern you'd expect to kind of continue as you move further away from the anchorage. And I've simply separated this figure out as well by anchorages and some of those control sites I talked about, just to highlight that a lot, the control areas, while they do have some variation because there's natural variation in these areas, there are far fewer troughs and disturbances in those control regions than we see in any of the anchorages that we were looking at. So just to summarize that a little bit, we really found that anchorages with higher use had more overall ruggedness and deeper perturbations, or these troughs in the center of anchorages, compared to ones with lower use or to adjacent areas where we don't have any anchoring activity. And then finally, as part of this work, we also have been interested in some of the potential impacts on the biological communities in these areas and around these anchorages. So to look at this, we conducted 21 ROV surveys, so that's remotely operated vehicle surveys, at 21 of the anchorages in the Southern Gulf Islands. And for each of these surveys at a target anchorage, we were able to fly the ROV in a straight transect that was about 800 meters long. So you can see how long that is in relation to how big some of these swing circles are. And we ran these transects to try and understand how gradients of animal communities change with proximity to disturbance in the center of these anchorages. In conjunction with that, we also collected a number of sediment grabs at these different anchorages, both to look at the grain size, so understand the type of sediment and how that changes in some of these different basins, but to also look at the infaunal community and try and understand what kinds of things are living in these habitats. And so I just wanted to show a couple of videos to demonstrate some of the differences in habitats that we see. So this is a video that was taken at a relatively undisturbed area showing, so these are sea whips. They're a type of sea pen. They're really beautiful, delicate structures that form biogenic habitat. And so you can see on some of these sea whips, there are basket stars. So these echinoderms that live up on these sea whips to help them filter feed. And you can imagine that these structures and habitats are very easily damaged by anchoring activity. Both, by being crushed by anchors, but as the sediment gets stirred up, they no longer have good holding in these areas. Then in comparison to this, we also have some video taken from the center of a very heavily used anchorage. And this is sort of demonstrating how turned up some of these areas can be. So you can actually see some of these troughs that are formed in the soft sediment. We like to call it a pump track because it kind of looks like a BMX track a kid might ride their bike over. But it's really stirred up, and we don't see a lot of that structure forming or bigger invertebrates that might be living in these soft sediment areas otherwise. So I just wanted to sort of end that section highlighting that we're still working with some of that data to look at patterns around the anchorages, but really what we found is that these soft sediment communities are really diverse. So this is an image that kind of highlights all of the different critters and animals that we've seen in some of these areas. There's all of these structure forming animals, as well as a number of different fish and invertebrate species that we found. So they're actually, potentially more diverse than we think about for some of these structures, or sorry, some of these areas. Yeah, I think it's just like really nice to highlight that these are very biologically diverse areas when people often think that they're just flat, barren mud areas. So after doing a lot of this work, there are still many questions remaining about commercial anchorages and their impacts. And so I just wanted to sort of move into highlighting some of the work that we've been doing on the North Coast, focused around the port of Prince Rupert. So just to situate you, down here, this red box at the bottom of the inset figure, that's the Port of Vancouver and the Southern Gulf Islands. And so we have currently been working up around the Port of Prince Rupert. So on the North Coast, they have 31 different designated commercial anchorages around the port. And so this is the area that we've been currently gathering data on. Like the southern anchorages, there's variable use at these anchorages. So these are just colored by anchoring events from 2023 and 2024. And so you can see that some of these anchorages are used a lot more heavily than others. So it also provides a nice kind of suite of anchorages to look at variations in use with benthic patterns. And so for this project, one of the big things that we wanted to do is make this a collaborative project and ask some questions in conjunction with some of the North Coast First Nations that live in this area. So we've been working very closely with teams from Loch Wallams and Kitsim on a lot of this work, in addition to still working with the Canadian Hydrographic Survey and our colleagues from NRCan on this work. And so this is ongoing and a research project that will wrap up next year. The main purpose of this project was really to continue to try and assess the impacts of commercial anchoring on significant benthic areas, but also include looking at things like glass sponge reefs, which are important biological structures, as well as overlap of these anchorages with potential areas for that are of importance from a cultural, social, and ecological perspective for our First Nations collaborators. And so as part of this project, we had a number of different questions that we were asking, and I'm just going to spend this last little section of the talk kind of showing some of the methods that we've been using for this and really just highlighting some images from our preliminary look at some of this data. So again, we're interested in how does physical disturbance vary around these anchorages? what kinds of sediment are in these areas and how does that compare, say, with some of the southern areas? What is the overlap of sponge reefs with some of these anchorages? And then also, what kinds of culturally important species do we find in these areas? And so these colors are kind of highlighting the different types of methods that we've been using to try and get at some of these questions. And I really do want to highlight that this has been a collaborative effort, and we've done a lot of collaborative data collection over the past couple of years, working with the technical staff from Loch Willems and Kitsim Kalem. And it's been really a fun experience to go out on their vessels and collect data in this region that I definitely wasn't familiar with. And yeah, it's been really nice having their expertise working on this project. So I just quickly want to highlight some of the different data sets we've collected that we've been working through. So in the summer of 2025, the Canadian Hydrographic Survey went up and they successfully did new multi-beam surveys around all of these anchorages for us. So the yellow polygons are highlighting the areas that they covered with multi-beam, which is really awesome because we now have brand new data of really high resolution where we can go and look at some of those different metrics of disturbance that I was talking about in the Southern Gulf Islands around all of these anchorages, where we really didn't have high resolution data for most of these areas, especially in the Inner Harbor. The previous multi-beam surveys, I think, were from around 2005. We've also done a number of sediment grabs. So on the right, here's an image of us pulling up this small Van Veen grab that we use off of their vessels to collect sediment in these areas. And on the left-hand side, this is an image of a sediment morphology map for the area. And you can see that around some of these anchorages, there are gaps in our understanding of the sediment type. So understanding the sediment type is very important for things like holding for anchors, understanding the benthic communities that might be around some of these areas. So we really wanted to try and fill in some of this map using these sediment grabs. But we also have been interested in the infaunal community in some of these areas. So my colleague, Lucy Hanna, has been spending a lot of hours looking at these sediment samples for us. And this is just a highlight of a few of the fun critters that she's found. So there's a lot of owl worms in these areas, crabs, scale worms, as well as different shellfish that she's been seeing. We were fortunate enough to do some ROV surveys at these anchorages as well. So Loch Willems has this small ROV, it's a Seymour ROV that we were able to take out for a few days and conduct some spot dives at some of these anchorages just to see what is down there. And so here's some somewhat blurry images. It's not a super high definition camera on this ROV, but this is a sculpin species, an eelpout, which is a very common species in these soft sediment habitats, as well as a flatfish that we saw. And then this is just a little video showing 3 different species of rockfish at one of the anchorages. And I also wanted to include it because it highlights that not all of these anchorages are in soft sediment. As you can see, there's boulders and rocks in this area, which is also really interesting to document because these potentially might have impacts on anchors that are being dropped in these areas if they're snagging in some of this rockier habitat. And then the final piece of data collection we've been doing is using these BRUV units. So they're baited remote underwater video systems. And this is what they look like here in the left-hand panel. And the cool thing about them is that they have 2 cameras that face a bait pole. So they're baited systems that bring animals into them. But by having 2 synchronized cameras, we're also able to, when we watch both videos at the same time, synchronize them and size different animals that we're seeing. So this is really important for, especially for looking at fish communities, because biomass is an important indicator for some of these different species. And so we're able to collect sizes for some of these individuals as well, which is a neat aspect. And so these are just a couple of images of us deploying them in November of last year at the anchorages. And I just wanted to include some images of the fun different animals that we've seen come into these baited systems. So we see halibut in some of these areas. This is a quillback rockfish, a number of ratfish. So these chimera really like hanging out in these soft sediment areas. And then we also had some lingcod come in as well. And just because it's fun, I wanted to include this final video just to show you that it's not only fish species that we see coming in to some of these baited videos. I apologize for how wavy this video is. It was a very choppy day out on the water. But you can see in this video, there are all of these marine worms that are swimming around, but we also had a very curious and hungry giant Pacific octopus come in and try and take over our camera for a little while. So it was really neat, and it's kind of nice to also be collecting videos in these areas and sharing them with our collaborators, because these deep water anchorages aren't areas that have a lot of research done in them, and also don't have a lot of imagery and videos collected at them. So as part of this project, we're right now continuing to annotate a lot of these videos, look at grain size, do calculations using the multi-beam data. And in this area, our goal is to really create a biophysical report using all of these data sets to try and basically create a report of baseline information on the seafloor and on ecological aspects of these anchorages. And have this report available for North Coast First Nations, for the Port of Prince Rupert, and for really any kind of conversations around decision making for these anchorages to help guide environmental assessments or the development of best practices around these anchorages. So with that, I really just want to say thank you to the huge number of people involved in this project. And to the field teams who've been helping us collect this data, as well as all of our collaborators within the federal government as well. And I will open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Fiona. Excellent presentation, super interesting. As promised, lots about the Salish Sea and a little peek at the North Coast, which was fantastic. I was doing a little quick Googling before, and just the size of the ports of Seattle versus Vancouver. Similar movement of containers. We have larger sort of bulk facility movement. So interesting to see how much of an impact this could be down your neck of the woods, Marielle, on the US side. So really interesting, relevant topic. I was also reminded we had this children's book, A Pod of Orcas, and it's like a counting book, like 10 blah blah, and one of them is 8 lonely freighters anchored in the bay. And it's so funny because it's a Vancouver book, and it's like we're so used to see they're part of our landscape up here. You're so used to seeing them in the port, but the expansion into the Gulf Islands and that's like relatively new in comparison. So quite interesting to see that outlook. So yeah, great presentation, Fiona. I really appreciate that. As Marielle mentioned at the beginning, it's being recorded, and I believe we're going to share the deck as well. You've got a method to do that. Perfect, Marielle. So yeah, with that, we'll just open it up to some questions. I see there's one in here from Dylan right away. You're welcome to turn your camera on and say hi, Dylan. If not, a quick question about Vancouver so bad for wait times, so hence increased anchoring in other places. So Fiona, you may or may not be able to answer that. Maybe that's a Transport Canada question, but you've probably done a little of your homework as a prelude to this. So feel free to weigh in if you know that.
Okay, so the question was just about why are the wait times
so
bad?
What makes Vancouver so much worse for the wait times and the increased anchoring?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's partially just like infrastructure catching up with the amount, like the increase in volume of ships, but also like there's a myriad of reasons why wait times can increase that are, related potentially to port capacity, but also the Port of Vancouver is receiving all of the marine trade sort of from Asia and the Pacific into Canada. So if there's any kind of delays in our rail systems or any other aspects of the transportation networks, it's all going to bottleneck kind of at our port. So I think that's part of it. But yeah, I don't have like a exact answer of why Vancouver is is particularly bad compared to other areas.
And we don't want to get into trouble with the longshoremen or all sorts of other people that we're calling out. So yeah, but I think it is like marine trade is on the upswing. Our infrastructure and capacity hasn't really adjusted to change for that. So I think Seattle's in a similar situation as Vancouver. So no big surprise there, I guess. Uh, Kaying Lei, I'm going to wreck your name. I'm sorry. Did you want to speak to your question directly, or are you okay to have me read it out? I'll just jump in then. In the anchored area video, there were small little creatures at the bottom. Were those the sea whips that have been destroyed due to anchoring, or just other benthic creatures? Some looked quite similar. So wondering if you can quantify. I think it's in the disturbed areas that she was
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about. So there looks like little breakage all over that could be sea whips or other things.
Yeah, I think in the disturbed video, there's definitely like broken shells and things that are kind of turned up. The interesting thing about sea whips that I've learned in the past while, because I've gone on a deep dive about sea whips, is that they sometimes do fall over, or some of the ones that are lying in the video of sea whips sometimes fall over because of predation, so they get eaten by nudibranchs. But also when they fall over, they can sometimes right themselves because they can fill their little peduncle, which is the part of them that sticks into the sediment, with water and right themselves. And they can also sometimes move around, which is crazy. So that might be some of the things that we're seeing fallen over were either dead pens or ones that were just, knocked over.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I'm gonna have to do some deep diving into sea whips too. That's super interesting. Lowell's got a question about, can ships use established buoys? I think so. Fiona presented this a little while ago to DFO, and I was like, that's crazy that every time we have a new ship in the harbor, we're dragging an anchor. So Fiona, I'm not sure if you have a Transport Canada answer for that, or it's like a safety at sea thing, but maybe jump. It's not really a science question, but jump on in if you can.
Um, so yeah, like talking about moorings essentially
Yeah,
and
yeah,
the use of
permanent
those.
moorings. Yeah.
Yeah, so permanent moorings. So we don't have any permanent moorings in the Port of Vancouver or Port of Prince Rupert right now. It's definitely something people have talked about. Um, they are tricky to put in for ships of this size just because you tend to not need just a single mooring. They're often like a tripod method of building anchors for a mooring buoy for ships this big. They do use them in some areas. They especially use them in areas where you're like offloading oil and things between ships where you're not having them dock and things like that. So the technology exists and it's a possibility, but I think it is a lot of you know effort and work and many steps to put them in some of these areas, and it is much easier to tell a ship to go just drop its anchor somewhere in some of these areas. But I think it's an ongoing conversation and something I've talked about with some folks, especially the Port of Prince Rupert, as a piece that they're considering. It's just sort of one of those things where it's like building the infrastructure for it, and it doesn't currently exist in these areas.
Yeah, I know there's some liability and stuff associated with that too. So D&D's got a couple moorages that are only used for D&D vessels.
Yeah.
And but like they have to be like dove and inspected regularly and for that weight. So there is a lot, there is some complexities to it that certainly differ than our little mooring buoys that we have for your 20-foot tinny, right? Okay, so there's a couple other questions. One from Jessica, or sorry, Nicole, just asking if you conducted the ROV sites and sediment grabs at any reference sites. Wasn't sure if they missed that
Mm.
in the talk. Yeah.
No, that is a great question. We didn't. We did try, and simply because of just time constraints, and it takes quite a while to do some of these transects. So we were targeting anchorages, but we were looking at anchorages that had a gradient of use. Some of these anchorages even are no longer in use. So we were trying to get sort of a range of different ones to compare kind of the communities to anchorages that are maybe more or less disturbed. The sediment
Okay.
grabs, though, we did get some of those at reference sites. Yeah.
Right. Perfect. Lauren Underwood's got her hand up, and then I'll go to a question in the chat from Jessica. Go ahead, Lauren.
So Lauren has masculine as opposed to feminine. When I was
Sorry,
a
I
child,
apologize. I
I
can't see
went
your
to the
smiling
Navy
face.
base for Christmas. My Christmas present was a sewing basket. Share. But
Apologies.
Marielle, I've done a lot of work with Lummi Tribe in the past, with Sea Dock Society out of University of California at Davis. We just wrapped up cumulative effects of marine shipping. We're moving into vessel management. And Transport Canada and First Nations Fisheries Council, we worked on the SEMS project for 5 years. We've just released it. I'd like to have Transport Canada um, send you all of the information, 452-page document. Awesome work. And we're the South Coast. There were 6 marine zones in Canada, including the Arctic, the Great Lakes, the Atlantic Ocean. Great work, but we're trying to do more with you folks on the other side of the 49th. So if we could stay in contact, I'd love you to put you in touch with Transport Canada lead that worked with us, and get involved. And I'm trying to get back down to Lummi and have the tribal executive join with us in Puget Sound Partnership, utilizing some of their staff as well. So great to see you, Marielle, and hope we can stay in touch.
That sounds lovely, and certainly happy to continue conversations. And also, we can share out resources with everyone who attended here too. So please feel free to also send on any of those pieces as well.
Yeah, that's exactly the point of this roundtable. Yay, connections across the border. I love it. We'll go into Jessica's question about the physical impact of the anchor on the sea floor. Is that the primary impact, or is there other impacts from ships at anchor, like blocking light, vibrations? I think you sort of talked about a couple of the other impacts from having ships sitting there, but I don't know if they were specific to the anchoring activity or just noise and light pollution. But if you can just speak to that a little bit more, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's definitely a potential, like a myriad of potential other impacts from having these ships located in these areas. We specifically were focusing in, as part of our research question on benthic impacts, but I know that there has been work done on noise from these vessels, and light from these vessels as well. So we outlined a lot of those potential impacts and connections in our sort of like pathways of effects work that we were doing. So I can link that paper as well, which highlights some of those different other aspects. But we like specifically in our data collection, we're having to scope the scale of our work to benthic impacts because it's very easy to, go off and try and ask many different questions. There are a lot of different aspects of this work. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I don't see any other questions in there right now. I had one just about the were you able to observe any sites that were previously used as anchorages and then hadn't been used for quite some while? Do we see some sort of natural attenuation or restoration occur from, like you said, the pump track? I know they're in typically fairly calm areas, so that it's a good, shipping parking zone. But do we know what that turnaround might be from post utilization to?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've talked with Karen Douglas at NRCan about this idea of recovery of anchorages. One of the tricky parts is like if you want to look at that, it's easiest to have repeat multi-beam surveys in an area, which we don't have in a lot of areas, but it's something that we have a little bit of. So we can start to look at. We had, I think, 9 or 10 disused anchorages, so ones that haven't been used since 2016, I believe. So it was like 5 or 6 years of not being used when we were looking at the data. And you see a very, a trend, I'll say, of potential recovery where they are sort of falling below that modeled line of the expected disturbance for the amount of time they were occupied. But we just have so few data points that it's kind of hard to directly say whether or not that's true. Some of those anchorages also are located in an area of the Southern Gulf Islands where it's a bit sandier and there's more water movement. So there's more potential for that sediment to be mobile as well. So you're kind of smoothing out some of that disturbance over time. So a little bit, potentially.
Yeah, yeah.
We're thinking
And
about
I
it.
think that's a hard thing. I mean, short of setting up an experimental location, that's quite challenging, right? We'll go one more question in the chat and then back to Lauren. What are the typical depth ranges of the anchorage sites?
Yeah, so these are deeper water ones. So they range kind of in depth from about 25 to 80 meters deep. So yeah, they have to be located in areas where these big ships can basically access them. In the port of Prince Rupert, they tend to be deeper because they're out in Chatham Sound. So some of those are, yeah, closer to the 80-meter range.
Yeah, that's quite deep. Lauren, back to you.
Thank you. Is there a reason why Nanaimo wasn't included?
That's a great question.
Gabriel, a resident, just hate anchorages, right? And the lighting and the noise. We've developed, Tristan Gale and I developed a barge that would provide power and permanent anchorages for ships so they don't have to anchor on the sea floor anymore. And we're moving that forward to be looked at as a solution. But I never said, I'm from Sail First Nation. We have federally designated reserves on Saturna Island at East Point, at Fulford Harbor, Salt Spring Island, and South Pender Island. So we have a vested interest in anchorages. So I read Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's letters of patent because I don't think they should have jurisdiction in our territorial waters or in Nanaimo's, but yet they seem to be getting Transport Canada to let them dictate anchorages under those letters of patent. And they still reference the monarch. Are you aware of any of? I know it's a little political. And Fiona, we usually rough you guys up, you folks up at DFO, but this was great. I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. That was very nice of you. I can speak a little bit to, so your first question was about Nanaimo. So that's a great question. Yes, there are 6 designated commercial anchorages around Nanaimo. And we did look at them a little bit. We have use data for them. The thing about Nanaimo is that a lot of those anchorages are located on bedrock or glacial material. So it's very hard to look at bottom impacts using multi-beam because they're in these rocky areas where you can't see the same kind of sort of impacts that you can see very clearly in soft sediment habitats. So that's the main reason why they aren't sort of in some of the analysis that I presented. And we just didn't have more recent multi-beam surveys for some of them. So I think only one of them was surveyed in the multi-beam surveys in 2022. And then, yes, to your question about jurisdiction, I'm aware that those conversations are going on. And so a lot of this work we're really doing to try and just support, having those conversations so there's actually information on what's happening on the seafloor. There's information on the species that's occurring in these areas, what kind of habitats they are in, to try and facilitate sort of more informed conversations and provide information about these areas, so that conversations about ecological aspects and biological pieces can be brought into some of those conversations. But yeah, this work is mostly like looking at some of those pieces, trying to gather information on it, then feed into some of those processes, but we're not directly involved in those conversations at this moment.
Yeah, we comfortably sit in the science side where we provide science advice and information and remain apolitical. One of the questions in the chat was about ballast water discharge, and I'll just say that we will not be the ones to answer that appropriately. There is requirements set out by Transport Canada, but again, we had a presentation by AIS a little while ago, and that's the kind of information that there's a whole group that works on ballast water associated with aquatic invasive species and shipping regulations. They're mostly based out of Ontario, but that's a great idea for a future topic, but I don't think we'll be able to answer that one today. So with that, I think those are all the questions that we've got on the chat and hands up. Muriel, maybe I'll hand it back over to you to just any last tie-ups in our next deck. And just super appreciative, Fiona, of your time today, coming to tell us about a very interesting project that you've had underway. Many people commenting in the chat about how great the graphics were. Really great at telling the story. So thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fiona. And certainly all the emoji reactions as you were showing various videos, I think speaks to how powerful those are in terms of bringing to life these impacts, and excited to see the ultimate findings that come out as you guys continue looking more. And it certainly has me curious to ask some questions of folks down in our neck of the woods around some of these impacts and similar sorts of opportunities for research. So appreciate you sharing where you guys are in this process.